Good day and welcome to the presentation by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. My name is Michéle Fourie. I am from the FICA Supervision, and today's presentation is going to deal with FICA supervision and enforcement by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. Joining me today is Charl Geel, and he will introduce himself.
Thank you, Michéle. Yes, as indicated, my name is Charl Geel. I'm also at the FSCA. I'm in the AML CFT Advisory Unit within the Office of General Counsel in the FSCA. And yes, I would like to participate and ask you a few questions. Thank you, Michéle.
Certainly, Charl. So just to make the presentation interesting, we will be doing a bit of role playing today. I will be playing the role of the supervisor, and Charl will be representing you, our viewer, as the accountable institution. So what do we have in store for you today? Well, we're basically going to explain to you the risk-based approach to supervision, our supervisory activities that relate to inspections and the directive to provide information. And last but not least, we will be dealing with enforcement.
Michéle, yes, maybe then for the first question, it's a question that we often get from the sectors out there, our accountable institution. But how do you decide on who to inspect? Sometimes you inspect me, but not my neighbor next to me. Sometimes you inspect other institutions and different jurisdictions. But on what basis do you choose who to inspect?
Excellent question, Charl. So yes, as a supervisory body, we obviously have the responsibility to supervise thousands of accountable institutions. And we will never really be able to have a one-on-one ratio of one analyst or inspector supervising one accountable institution. So in terms of volume, we definitely have to prioritize who we will inspect and who we will apply a lower type of supervisory activity to. But it's not just that simple, and it's not just a numbers game. More importantly, about the risk institution, money laundering. So let me start at the beginning. We have to explain the inherent risks that we believe are applicable. We'll deal a bit later with controls, but because the inherent risks really have a higher weighting and it is predominant that we identify the risks first before we can deal with controls, I'd like to take you through these inherent risks. So yes, we cannot supervise an accountable institution if we do not understand the nature of your business and what you do and what you look like. So we focus first of all on the characteristics of an accountable institution. The size of your business, the nature of your business, the structure of your business. What is the difference between the business of a funeral parlor compared to a hedge fund manager or an asset manager? So we need to understand and get that information first so we can assess the level of money laundering, terror financing risk that is attached to the characteristics of your business. We then have to deal with customers. It's easy to make a differentiation purely just on natural persons or legal persons, but we do have to look at it at a more granular level. Is a natural person perhaps also a politically exposed person, like a DPIP or a FPPO? Or is the legal person part of a very complex structure or a very simple structure perhaps? Thirdly, we deal with products and services. So we have to try and apply our minds and look at the type of products that display characteristics that could be more tempting for money launderers and terror financiers to abuse. So think of examples like unlisted securities, or when there is perhaps a foreign exposure involved to the product or service that's rendered by the accountable institution. Fourthly, we deal with distribution channels. There are many distribution channels, and some of them are perhaps very traditional, like face-to-face engagements. But as technology advancements progress in society, as well as in the financial services sector, certainly we have to consider the fact that electronic platforms, mobile devices and apps are part of a generation we live in, and certainly is part of the distribution channels currently applied by several accountable institutions. We also focus on geographic location. Yes, it's easy to make a distinction between local and foreign. However, is that where we should stop? What about local or foreign would make an accountable institution attract more or less money laundering and terror financing risk? Could it be that a person, when the customer is perhaps in Klerksdorp versus close to a border, but they're both local, does that make a difference? And when it's foreign, does it make you inherently higher risk if your location is foreign? What about if that foreign location is in fact a member country, part of the member society of the FATF environment, or if it's a grey listed country, or a country with a very good and well-developed and sophisticated money laundering and terror financing combating regulatory environment? So those are definitely things we have to consider. Last but not least, a controversial item is adverse information. So when we deal with adverse information, we have to consider things like adverse media, for example, but also more concrete items such as previous sanctions, convictions, complaints, irregularity reports, or tip-offs. So we have to be very mindful and cautious, though, that if a person's name or a business's name appears in a newspaper, and there are allegations of money laundering or terror financing, those remain allegations. It will make you cautious, but everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But it will definitely attract attention, and it considers some weighting in our consideration when we risk rate an accountable institution. Charl, does that explain to you, in terms of inherent risks, why we select some accountable institutions, perhaps, that some are weighted and rated as a higher risk than others?
Yes, Michéle, thank you very much. Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the inherent risk criteria or element that you consider then basically deals with the characteristics of the institution that make them vulnerable to money laundering and terrorist financing. As you explained, there are various components under the inherent risks, such as the customer profile, the product or services, distribution channel, geographic location, adverse information. So all of these are characteristics of the institution that will make them vulnerable, and something that you consider as part of deciding which institution to inspect and which not.
Charl, that is absolutely correct. And I think for further guidance in terms of typologies or examples regarding inherent risks, I would encourage you as an accountable institution to also have a look at Guidance Note 7 that was published by the Financial Intelligence Center. That will just provide additional information and confirms your understanding. So following the identification of risk, we are all aware that it makes sense to try and mitigate those risks. And certainly we have to do that by developing and applying controls. So the controls that we are going to focus on today deals with compliance, training, record keeping, screening, and reporting. So compliance basically deals with whether or not an accountable institution established a compliance framework in terms of money laundering and terror financing, and whether the board or senior management in fact takes accountability to make sure that there's compliance with the FICA Act and implementation of controls to ensure that the risks are mitigated. We also then have to talk about training. So training has been an old standing requirement. The only difference due to the amendment of the FICA Act, and these amendments came into effect on 2 October 2017, really is that the training has to be ongoing And training has to be conducted in terms of the requirements set out in the FICA Act, as well as the risk management and compliance program that is developed by you as an accountable institution. The scope and frequency of the training is really based on your own discretion as an accountable institution. There is no term linked to what is regarded as ongoing. I think if you have to assess your own staff, their ability to absorb new information, understand your controls so that they can implement it to mitigate risks, then you stand a much more chance to effectively apply your risk management and compliance program, because people cannot apply policies effectively if they don't understand them, and you bridge that gap by training. Dealing with record keeping. Now, record keeping is an important requirement and control. And the purpose is really not just if there is an inspection conducted in terms of the FICA Act that we want to see your records, and that's why you need to keep records. Records will enable you as an accountable institution, providing you keep record of the appropriate information and you keep the records safe for the appropriate amount of time, that you can monitor the behavior of your customers, because you have records to reflect on in terms of what you initially obtained from the customer. So which records should be kept? At least the customer due diligence information and transactions. With regards to third-party record keeping, you will be well aware as an accountable institution that your records may be kept by a third party, that even if the records are kept by a third party, you have to inform the Financial Sector Conduct Authority as well as the Financial Intelligence Center of the details of who and where these records are kept by the third party, and to make sure that you have safe access to those records and in a timeliest manner can retrieve those records. Another important control obviously is screening. So part of knowing who you're doing business with, the requirements or controls that will effectively help you deal with screening, the appropriate sanction lists, to ensure that you get an opportunity to validate information that was provided to you and that you really understand the person that sits in front of you, that you enter into a business relationship with or doing a single transaction for. We also have to look at reporting. Reporting is quite a wide topic. When we think of reporting at the FSCA, we think of your understanding as an accountable institution of your reporting obligations set out in terms of the Financial Intelligence Center Act that relates to cash threshold reports, suspicious and unusual transaction or activity reports, and the like. Do you know how to report? Do you understand when to report and what to report and who to report to? We also, in terms of reporting, consider whether you as an accountable institution understand your statutory obligations when submitting statutory returns and reports to the FSCA as a supervisory body. And just to make this a little bit more granular, although it's not a legal requirement for all accountable institutions to in fact have an internal and external audit function, it would certainly be helpful that if those functions do exist, that those functions have a special focus on money laundering and terror financing risks and controls, because they are in a position then to provide reports to the senior management and the board and escalate matters for their attention that they perhaps picked up, that if addressed can just strengthen the mitigation of money laundering and terror financing in that accountable institution, to strengthen those processes.
All right, so thank you, Michéle. So if I understand you correctly, the second element that you look at, which you call controls, are basically how well do we as accountable institutions comply with the FICA Act. So I suppose you look at historical information to determine the specific element.
That is absolutely correct, Charl. And I think it's also important that we all understand that this is always subject to review. So this is not a stagnant position. Controls are there to be developed, tested, implemented, and when found wanting, to be reviewed and re-evaluated and perhaps enhanced to make sure that they effectively do control and have a mitigating effect on the inherent risks that were identified. Last but not least, I want to add, Charl, I've mentioned the risk management and compliance program several times, but it is important to highlight that this is part of an accountable institution's toolbox. It really doesn't matter what you call the document, as long as it effectively reflects the identification of risk that you conducted, how you assessed your MLTF risk, and what controls you actually have in place. Your risk management and compliance program is a how-to document, a living document that is custom to your specific business profile as an accountable institution. And really no two risk management and compliance programs are the same, because if a risk-based approach is followed, it is a subjective assessment. So the other important thing is there's no sense or real value in just copying and pasting the items or the requirements in the FICA Act over into a document that says Risk Management and Compliance Program. If that document does not give you guidance and help you, or is a tool that you can consult, you and your staff as an accountable institution, to understand how you must risk rate your customers, or what kind of customer due diligence should be conducted, or what records should be kept, how must it be kept, then really, I think we miss the point. So we have to start understanding and appreciating the fact that what we include in our risk management and compliance program really should be information that can be effectively applied in a practical way. Do you have questions about the risk management and compliance program, Charl?
Michéle, yes, the risk management and compliance program is something that I think we're struggling a little bit from an institutional point of view. We're not always too sure, what risks to take into account when we do a bit of a risk assessment. Do you have maybe a template available that we can use? Can we use a template from another institution? What would you recommend as the regulator here?
Charl, that is a very practical and excellent question, which I think is very prevalent. Moving from a rules-based approach to a risk-based approach in terms of or following the amendments to the Financial Intelligence Center Act in October 2017. I think it required a very big mind shift, both for us as supervisory bodies and regulators, as well for accountable institutions. We were also used to a tick box, and if we do everything that's on the list, then we will not be in trouble with a supervisor or a regulator. Now the requirements allows us to apply our own minds and be subjective about how we understand risk, how we perceive it, and what we do about it. But it does appear that that created a little bit of uncertainty with regards to where do I start to draft an RMCP. And I think the first advice I would give is for every accountable institution to be confident in their own assessment of risk and not to try and draft a risk management and compliance program to the satisfaction of someone else, including a supervisor or a regulator. A big help would be to consider the content again, as I referred to previously, Guidance Note 7 that was published by the Financial Intelligence Center. It really puts the new requirements and the amendments to the FICA Act in a practical manner and provides explanations. And then it really is a matter of doing self-reflection and applying your own mind and time and make an effort to sit and think, which risks am I really exposed to as an accountable institution? Does it look different to my neighbors or a big institution or a foreign institution? What am I vulnerable to? How can my business be used to launder money or finance terrorism? And you can go through all those items that's listed in Guidance Note 7 and the examples given, such as customers, products and services, geographic location, and the like, and identify for yourself to what extent your specific accountable institution could be vulnerable. And then once you've identified those risks, just write them down on paper. And then you apply your mind to which controls could possibly alleviate this risk, mitigate it. There is no such place or idea as a no-risk environment. Doesn't matter if you don't collect cash or if you've known your customers for 30 odd years, there's always an element of risk. And once we understand and appreciate that, and do not set ridiculous expectations for ourselves, but we draft a document that helps us how to risk rate a client or how to do the appropriate level of customer due diligence. And we can review that document as our product or service offering change, as our customer base change, and the like. It's a living document. If you understand that, you'll go a long way in preparing an implementable and effective risk management and compliance program. I hope that helps, Charl.
Yes, it definitely helps me. Thank you, Michéle. Maybe just to go on to a following question, we were talking about a risk-based approach to supervision, and part of it is on-site supervision and a part of it is off-site supervision. Now, with regards to on-site supervision, that's where you physically go to an institution to inspect their compliance with the FICA Act. But with COVID-19, there were some travel restrictions, and certainly at this stage it's still very difficult moving around between provinces and visiting specific institutions. So how has that affected the FSCA's approach to conducting on-site inspections?
Thank you, Charl. So yes, we certainly did not come out of this pandemic unscathed ourselves, because we also had to rethink our approach to inspections. We realized that we cannot be in a position as a supervisor that we do not conduct inspections at all because of the value that an inspection has. But simultaneously, we have to also abide by the laws of the land, and we obviously have a great deal of respect for the regulations that were implemented to save lives. So we had to look at how can we still be able to conduct inspections effectively, but honoring the restrictions that came as a result of the lockdown regulations. So what we decided to do is to basically combine desk-based analysis with a virtual engagement with the accountable institution. So we would basically draft a formal appointment letter in which we would line out the scope of the inspection. We would request availability of the accountable institution on an appropriate date that is suitable and convenient. And we would request information up front from the accountable institution that we can analyze that relates to our desk-based supervisory activities. We do that in preparation for the accountable institution being inspected on the day of the virtual engagement. On the day of the virtual engagement, we deal with the items that were listed in the appointment letter in line with the scope of the inspections. For this year, for example, we decided to limit the scope to risk assessment, customer due diligence, and reporting only. And our approach has very much changed from that of just being compliance driven and asking you questions to which you could easily in the past just answer yes or no and it would be the end of that. We actually now try and assess your real understanding of the risks that you identified and how you apply that understanding. Because there is a big difference between having a beautiful document that's called a risk management and compliance program, but you as the accountable institution perhaps borrowed it from a buddy, or you're not understanding what the content is because you didn't provide content or context to it, and that's going to hamper the effective implementation of that tool. During the inspection, we will interview the senior management and the money laundering compliance officer, like I said, to assess your level of understanding and the extent to which you in real life apply the controls to mitigate the risks that you identified, and that you conduct the customer due diligence in line with your risk management and compliance program. Coming back after the inspection, we actually draft a report that's subject to internal review, followed by a feedback letter that is issued to you as the accountable institution. Now, it's important to understand that the feedback letter can take many shapes or forms in terms of the message that it communicates. But regardless of the message, it always provides you as the accountable institution with an opportunity to make representations and to give us satisfactory feedback that you remediated any item that could possibly during the inspection have been found wanting in terms of compliance. And as I said, we also intend to continue the current approach that we are applying now, to really just focus on both technical compliance as well as effectiveness, the soundness of your implementation of controls, and to verify that by means of looking at client files, bank statements, and any other documentation such as your policies and procedures that you have developed to help you combat money laundering and terror financing in your business as an accountable institution. Following inspections, we also do desk-based supervision. In terms of desk-based supervision, Charl, I'm sure that you as an accountable institution have questions about whether we are going to issue a compliance report in due course, because you have not had one in quite a few years, right?
Yes, I haven't completed one for about 2 to 3 years. So I was wondering what's going on with this. Are you going to send something out for us to complete?
Definitely. So with bated breath, we hope to issue early in the new year, in 2021, a directive to provide information. Now, as you said, you haven't had to complete a compliance report in a long time. And the reason for that is the amendments to the FICA Act and the fact that we wanted to remove the questions we previously incorporated in the compliance reports issued by the FSCA to create a standalone FICA compliance report. Now that is under construction and in progress and will be communicated with the industry as soon as that is available to complete. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, we want to understand and assess the level of compliance of all accountable institutions early in the new year. So we intend to issue the directive to provide information that will need to be completed by all accountable institutions. This directive, Charl, is issued in terms of Section 43A of the Financial Intelligence Center Act. Under why a directive and a compliance report? Well, the two may not be rolled out simultaneously, and we regard the directive to provide information as an additional tool in our supervisory toolkit. Why would we want to issue that? Well, there's quite a few good reasons for that. We need to assess the level of compliance, at least on a technical level, and the DPI that we loosely refer to as the directive to provide information is going to give us a very good opportunity to do that. The results from completion of the DPI may also inform to an extent the sector risk assessment that was published by the FSCA in May 2019 and is currently under review. The results of the DPI will also assist us refining our risk-based approach to supervision and inform the topics that we need to address when we have presentations and awareness campaigns such as the one that we are busy with today. And last but not least, it also informs the scope of our on-site inspections. Now, the directive to provide information will be launched and be available online only, and all accountable institutions would be required to complete it because it is a directive that is lawfully given to the accountable institutions by the supervisory body. And the directive to provide information has a very broad content that really ranges from risk-based approach, risk management and compliance program, customer due diligence, training, record keeping, reporting, screening, sanctions, terror financing, and even crime.
Well, that sounds very interesting, Michéle. You say we can expect it that this in the new year, 2021. And I just hope you give me enough time to complete the directive.
Of course, Charl. We will definitely be fair and reasonable in terms of the time afforded to accountable institutions to complete. It is not a difficult set of questions. In fact, we made it very easy for you with drop downs, and all you have to do is to say yes, no, not applicable. So it won't take you that long at all to complete. I'm sure you will just do fine when you complete it, and we will keep the industry in the loop and give you enough forewarning of the moment it becomes available that you can prepare yourself and take the time that you need within reason to complete the directive to provide information. So Charl, after inspections, usually whether it is on or off-site or desk-based analysis, we do sometimes, however, find that there are some accountable institutions that are issued with what is called administrative sanctions. So removing your hat as an accountable institution now, Charl, and putting on your cap as the specialist in the AML unit of the Office of General Counsel, I would like to talk to you about what administrative sanctions are. Can you explain to accountable institutions what types of sanctions you get and what the purpose of these sanctions are? Is it just because we want to prejudice the industry that we issue these sanctions? Why do we do this as a supervisory body?
Yes, Michéle, yeah, the outcomes of an inspection can lead to either two types of action. It can either lead to enforcement action, which I'm going to discuss now, or it can lead to some remedial action, where the inspector will just advise you as an accountable institution within a specific period. But if the non-compliance is so serious, we can consider enforcement action. Now, enforcement action, if I talk about that, it relates to possibilities of imposing a sanction, an administrative sanction on you as an accountable institution. Now, there are various sanctions that we can impose. It can be a caution, it could be a reprimand, it could be a directive to take remedial action, a restriction or suspension of business activities, or eventually it could be a financial penalty. The financial penalty, there's a maximum prescribed in the FICA Act of 50 million rand for a business, for an FSP, for instance, if they fail to comply with the FICA Act. So it's quite serious. Now, what do we look at? How do we decide which penalty or sanction to impose? It all depends on aggravating and mitigating factors. Here you will see a list of aggravating and mitigating factors that we consider. This is not a complete list, but just a mere example of what we usually do consider. For instance, in the aggravating space, we look at the long period of the non-compliance. We're looking at a large number of clients of the accountable institution that the institution haven't conducted customer due diligence on. We're looking at a large number of unreported transactions, issues such as a willful non-compliance, whether there's actually money laundering and terrorist financing taking place in the institution as a result of the non-compliance. We're also considering issues such as systemic non-compliance or repeat offenders, and also previously been sanctioned for similar contravention. So those are some of the aggravating factors that we look at. From a mitigating factors that we look at, whether you've cooperated with the inspectors, whether you've remediated the non-compliance that we identified. Now, just on remediation, that doesn't mean that we can't, or should not or cannot sanction you because you now have remediated non-compliance, but it's a mere mitigating factor that we do take into account. We do take into account ignorance, so if you were unaware of the obligations, we also would consider that as a mitigating factor. Whether this is a once-off incident, whether you've self-discovered the non-compliance. That's very important. If you self-discovered the non-compliance and informed us as a regulator, then it obviously will count as a mitigating factor. If it's a short period of non-compliance, and whether you've taken steps to prevent the reoccurrence of the non-compliance. So all of these are factors that we consider and that will lead to what type of sanction to impose, as well as if it's a financial penalty, what the amount of the penalty should be.
Charl, is it then possible that I can still be sanctioned as an accountable institution because of what the inspectors found at the day of the inspection, even though I've since remediated the non-compliance?
Yes. So the sanctions then being imposed on what happened on the day of the inspection, so you'll be sanctioned for that specific period. Obviously, if you subsequently remediate the non-compliance, it's a mitigating factor, and we will reduce the sanction. Obviously, there is always the risk that institutions may wait until the inspectors inspect them before they start doing any FICA-related compliance matters, and we want to prevent that, and that's why we will issue a sanction if you're non-compliant on the date of the sanction.
Thank you, Charl. So what are the main areas of non-compliance that you picked up were prevalent in the sanctions issued recently?
Yes, obviously there has been a few sanctions that have been imposed, but some of the major things that we saw is that the issue of training. Obviously, the people do not train their staff on the RMCP, the Risk Management and Compliance Program, as well as the Financial Intelligence Center Act. Remember that the FICA Act says you have to train your staff on both. How frequent do you need to train your staff? The FICA Act is not very specific on that, but my advice would be train them in such a manner that they will always be able to comply with the RMCP and the FICA Act. We've also seen some issues on reporting. So that's where the institution failed to submit cash threshold transaction reports, terror property reports, or suspicious transaction reports to the FIC. Remember, there's also a specific time period within which you have to file these transactions to the FIC. So if you're late in filing those, we can also sanction you for that. In terms of the risk management and compliance program, the RMCP, there have been several sanctions, and this is a trend where the risk assessment is not set out in the RMCP. So although there is a document in place, we do not see where you've conducted your risk assessment or how you come to the conclusion that a specific institutional client is low, medium, or high risk. It's not in line with the nature, size, or structure of the business. So obviously, as Michéle explained, you have to consider the characteristics of your institution and what makes them vulnerable to money laundering and terrorist financing, and apply the mitigating factors in line with your risk assessment of the various products, geographical location, as well as the client type that you're dealing with. We've also seen some technical non-compliance and effectiveness non-compliance. So when it relates to technical non-compliance, so that is, we do not comply with Section 42.2 of the FICA Act. The Section 42.2 indicates some specific things that you have to state in your RMCP. What we found is that not all of those elements are stated in the RMCP. When it comes to effectiveness, that is where we test whether you are actually complying with your own risk management and compliance program. So we've seen that in some cases there is a good RMCP in place, but the staff do not follow the RMCP in what they have to do. We've also seen some customer due diligence, and that relates to the effectiveness element, where the institution do not conduct a customer due diligence in line with the RMCP. And that's very important. As soon as you've indicated that you're going to obtain, for instance, an ID number and proof of residence, and you do not do that when we conduct the inspection, it's obviously a non-compliance with your customer due diligence obligations.
Sure, Charl, that is a mouthful. But as I'm understanding, we do publish the sanctions that were issued. So can you take us through a few examples, perhaps, of the sanctions that were issued and published, and perhaps just explain the purpose of why these sanctions get published?
Yes, Michéle, as the question you've earlier asked as well, the purpose of issuing a sanction is for dissuasive purposes, to dissuade you for so you're not non-compliant in the future, but also the industry at large. And that's why we also publish these sanctions, to act as a deterrent. Now, these sanctions are published on the FSCA website. There's a specific tab for AML CFT matters, and all the sanctions that we issue needs to be published, unless if there are substantial and compelling circumstances justifying the non-publication of the specific sanction. So please have a look at our website, see what sanctions have we imposed. But some of the sanctions, we do not specify the names here, but just to give you an indication of what the contravention was and what the sanction was. For instance, the first one, you will see there was CIV. That's your customary identification, verification requirement and training requirement, and there's a sanction of 400,000 Rand being imposed. The one beneath that, RMCP training, CDD, record keeping, 125,000 Rand. And so you can through a list some of the sanctions we do suspend, or part of the sanctions we do suspend, depending on the factors of the specific matter. We have received some questions about, but there seems to be a bit of a misalignment between the contravention and the sanctions that we impose. So, for instance, in one case, we may impose for CIV training, you would see 400,000 Rand, and the other one, there's actually more contraventions, RMCP training, CDD, and record keeping, but the sanction is only 125,000 Rand. So why is there a difference where there's more contraventions? Now that will all depend on various factors. As I already indicated, we consider the aggravating and the mitigating factors. We also look at the size of the institution as well, whether they're a small, medium, large, or even a macro institution. So as you see on the slide, all the mitigating and aggravating factors will mean that the sanction will not always be exactly the same as in all cases.
Thank you, Charl. So that is really indicative also of a risk-based approach and dealing with each case on its own merit to find the most suitable and appropriate kind of sanction in line with the type of contravention. So that deals then, Charl, with our session today, where we discussed risk-based approach, our supervisory activities that relate to inspections, the directive to provide information, as well as enforcement action that may occur and be instituted following supervisory activities performed in terms of money laundering and terror financing supervision. Thank you, Charl, for your participation today, and I hope you as the viewer and the accountable institution found this valuable and that you can implement the guidance we conveyed in this presentation in your own business to make your own controls more meaningful, effective, and that this enhanced your understanding of inherent risks. Thank you.